Hello, thank you for being in a new video. This time we have the comparison between Galaxy S24 Ultra that we have on the left and iPhone 15 Pro Max that we have on the right. We are going to begin. In this first test, we are evaluating the resolution of the cameras. In theory, Samsung should have more detail because it has 200 megapixels in this main camera, while Apple is left with 48. But let's see if in practical life that difference is actually noticeable. Let's try to get as close as we can to this yellow flower. And notice that on Samsung it looks pretty well detailed. Let's see in the case of Apple if you get to notice the same level of detail or not. And I think it falls a little short. In fact, the same textures of the green leaves I think are much better distinguishable on Samsung. So definitely this first point of detail level is going to go to Samsung. We're going to try to get even closer to make this difference even more noticeable. So it's very clear that this first point goes to Samsung. Now we'll also evaluate the level of detail, but from the telephoto camera, because remember, in Samsung's case, they've gone up to 50 megapixels, while Apple is still left with 12 megapixels. So mind you, let's zoom in again with this 50 megapixel photograph, and yes, we get to notice very good level of detail. And in the case of the iPhone, again, it falls a little bit short in this detail aspect. So I think it's pretty clear here the result. Again, the point is gonna go to Samsung. I hadn't updated the scoreboard, but it's already with the 2 points going to Samsung. Now we're going to evaluate the ultra-wide camera outdoors. We're going to see what they can offer us, especially in terms of wide and in terms of distortion correction or chromatic aberration, because obviously at first glance they look like very similar pictures. But let's zoom in a little bit on these edge areas to see what it looks like in the Samsung case and what it looks like in the Apple case as well. Well, the truth is that they look very similar. It even looks like the same photograph. Let's go to the bottom, and again, they look very, very similar. Let's go to the other end. I don't think I would dare to give a winner here. Let's go to the top. The only difference I notice is the blue color of the sky. That's the most obvious difference, but in all other respects, the photographs look very similar. I don't think we're gonna give anyone the point in this case. Now let's evaluate the main camera of both devices in automatic mode outdoors. Again, we are going to try to zoom in to see some differences. In fact, I can already see the difference in the ground as well. A bit warmer in Apple's case, and the sky looks slightly different as well. But it seems to me that Samsung has updated their device as compared to the last generation. The colors look much more natural. Before they looked overly saturated, and now the color actually looks very nice. But let's zoom in again to look at the details on the edges for the lenses, and notice that Samsung has this little problem with some distortions here generated as blurs, whereas Apple looks like a completely clean picture. Definitely that here I think Apple is superior. Let's go to the other side and look again. On Apple we have extremely clean photography, whereas on the Galaxy again we see this generated blur which is not nice at all. And the same thing is going to happen on all the edges on Galaxy. Notice, let's zoom in on this other edge and see how this area is already out of focus. Let's see, in the case of the iPhone, it comes out with a much more accurate focus. There is no doubt in this case it looks like iPhone has a better quality lens, although Samsung has tied things up a lot with respect to color accuracy. But the point definitely goes to the iPhone. Now let's evaluate the backlit photograph. But before the final photograph, let's evaluate the preview. Because previously iPhone did show this optimized view and Samsung did not. But from this generation, Samsung also seems to have optimized the preview well, so that you don't see the overexposed areas that were visible before. So I even think it looks slightly better on Samsung in this preview. But since it's just a preview, I don't think we're going to give anyone the point anymore in this case. Previously, this point always went to the iPhone. But now Samsung has tied this situation. So let's evaluate the final result, and this is what we have. Notice, again, they look very similar pictures. I insist that Samsung has really improved their color rendition. Let's zoom in here in the shadow area, and now also on the iPhone. And the only difference that I can see is in the hair, because in all other things it actually looks very similar. But on iPhone, notice how we have a little bit darker hair, in Galaxy a little bit lighter, but at the same time it reveals more details. The truth is, I don't know if one is better than the other, I just feel there are differences. It seems like the iPhone photo has a little more contrast. Although in fact, if we're going to look at other areas now here on Earth, although it already comes out a little out of focus because the focus is centered on my face, it does look slightly overexposed, the photograph on Samsung. Even in this part of the iPhone photograph, you can notice how here in the iPhone photograph you can perceive the texture. Whereas on the Galaxy, that texture is completely lost. So for a very, very minimal difference, I'm going to give the point to the iPhone. Now let's go to a night photograph. And let's see what these devices can offer us. Of course, there's an intense light source here, which could complicate things in this photo. And let's see who interpreted this part better. I think they have a very similar, if not identical, result. So, the brightest lit areas seem to be slightly overexposed on both devices, but now let's focus on the darker areas. On iPhone there seems to be a bit of noise present, but I think the Galaxy noise is more apparent. Neither took a completely clean photograph, but I think this Samsung noise looks like it's a bit more intense. In the case of the iPhone, I think the graininess is not as evident as it is on Samsung. Let's see anyway the details that reach to perceive in this plant. And again, notice that Samsung has a lot of graininess, whereas the iPhone picture seems to have a little bit cleaner environment. So again, I'm going to give the point to the iPhone, but I also want to highlight the presence of these reflections on the iPhone. Notice, this is a lens flare that is not generated on Galaxy. So that's also very important to have a clean photograph. So I think we're going to give a point to each one. Again, we evaluated night photography, but with the ultra-wide camera. And at first glance, I'm noticing that in Samsung, you can perceive a little more detail in the textures, but also much more noise. Notice in this part, which is the darkest part, the amount of noise that Galaxy has, while iPhone has much cleaner photography. But let's go to the bottom part, because that's where I noticed a little better texture in Galaxy. Let's take a look. And yes, you do get to notice a little bit more texture, but again, you see quite a bit of noise and graininess, whereas the iPhone photo looks a little bit cleaner. Overall, I think the Samsung photo seems to have better detail, but more noise, and that's pretty much par for the course. Almost always devices that have better detail at night also have more noise. It is very complicated to maintain the level of detail while eliminating noise, and that is something that very few manufacturers can achieve. So neither picture seems perfect to me because Samsung has more detail but more noise as well, and the iPhone has less noise but less detail as well. So who would you give the point to? I don't think I'm going to give it to anyone. Now again, we are evaluating night photography but with the telephoto lens. In this case, it should be noted that Apple has a better aperture, so in theory it should perform better. But notice how in the area of more light, they seem to have very similar performance. Slightly better the iPhone, it seems to me, but very little difference. And in the darker area now, the opposite is true. The iPhone has much more noise present, as you can notice, while Galaxy has a much cleaner picture. And in this part where we see already a little more color, it also seems to me that Samsung has better definition. Surely with the help of the 50 megapixel sensor, it compensates a little bit that it doesn't have as much aperture as the iPhone. So it's very curious, but in this photograph I think it is very clear who the winner is, and it will be the Galaxy. Now let's take a penumbra photograph, but first I want you to see the preview, because just like Samsung improved the backlit preview and now it's better, in this case the iPhone's penumbra preview is much better. Notice how you get to see the colors, you get to see the detail. So when you go to take a picture, you anticipate that this device is gonna have a very good ability to take a good picture. On the contrary, in the case of Samsung, the preview looks pretty bad with a lot of noise, very pale colors, so one anticipates that the picture is not going to come out as good quality. So, for a better preview, we give the point to the iPhone. And now let's see how the result is. I remind you that in this photograph there was very low and very far away indirect light, so it's a practically dark photograph. And notice that Samsung got the detail very well and the color very well. Let's zoom in on the iPhone to see if we get to notice the same detail. Both did a good job, although I feel similar. The truth is that both did a good job, although I feel that Samsung's picture is generally better lit. Notice in these areas that are the darkest, as the iPhone no longer has information and appears completely dark. So I think Samsung is able to illuminate these areas better, and that's why it's winning. But let's try to see other details in the darker areas. Let's see. In this case, both devices use night mode. And notice that again, Samsung has a cleaner picture. In the case of the iPhone, there appears a little more noise present here. And Samsung, despite having the cleaner photo, it seems to me to still retain detail well. At least enough to still appreciate a good picture. So Samsung has better light gathering, better noise control, and therefore is going to take the point in this twilight photo. And to finish with the night photography, I also wanted to test how the telephoto lenses do, but in an area where there's not so much light. And the color rendition is totally different on the two devices. It seems to me that Samsung does a more true-to-life rendition because the indirect lighting it was dealing with was warm light. So it looks much more similar in Samsung's case. Let's zoom in again to see a little bit more detail in these pictures. And I think again on Samsung you see more detail, so it's going to take the point. And this, I have to say, surprises me because the iPhone has better aperture on that lens. So in theory it should have better light input. But I think Samsung, for merging the pixels of this 50 megapixel sensor, it does a very good job at night, surprisingly. So the point goes to Galaxy. But now we evaluate the daytime zoom in simpler conditions for both devices. And again, they look very similar pictures. The clearest difference I see is just the color rendition of the green of these leaves. It looks a little bit warmer on Samsung, but honestly, that's the only difference I can tell at a glance. Let's try to zoom in to see how these parts are distinguished. And in this case, it looks very similar to me again. I feel like on the iPhone it looks slightly but very slightly more grainy. Notice especially on the inside of this window, which is the darkest part. There you get to distinguish it a little bit more. On Samsung the picture is slightly cleaner, but at the same time that can prevent textures from appearing. Look at the texture of this little house. I think it looks very, very good on iPhone, and on Galaxy you can lose a little bit of that texture. No? I don't know, the truth is that they are very similar pictures. You just have to look at the smallest details to tell which one is better than the other. Again, notice how the roof of this little house has a much more marked texture on the iPhone. And Galaxy has a slightly smoother texture. Very few differences, honestly. But on this occasion, for those slightly more marked textures on iPhone, we're going to give the iPhone the point. But now let's see how they fare with the iPhone's maximum zoom, which is 25x. And on Galaxy, still 25x is not their maximum, nor is it from their set presets. So here is proof of how Samsung is telling the truth, when it claims that it is optimized zoom at any setting, not only at 2x, 5x and 10x, if not, even if you use 12.5x, it's going to be optimized as well. Even look at what this little reflection looks like. And in the case of the iPhone, a lot of detail is lost. Also in the rear areas you see less detail, and on Samsung I think you see a much more detailed picture. Plus, Samsung allows you to go up to 100x. So the zoom is much more capable on Samsung still. So, point for Samsung. Now let's evaluate macro photography. And first I want you to see how close you can get to small objects with the main camera. Both devices automatically switch to the ultra-wide camera for this type of photography, but both also allow you to turn that automatic switch off. So I turned that switch off to see how close I could get. And with the Samsung camera you can get much closer. And as you can see, while the focus isn't totally smooth, I still think it manages to capture some of the picture that we want. Whereas on the iPhone, you have to be much further away. And notice how it doesn't manage to focus well either. In fact, it only focused on this part. The focus is very inaccurate because of the aperture and the distance they have with the sensor. But definitely that Samsung can get the focus better on small objects with the main camera. And Samsung could be even better if they bring back the dual aperture that the Galaxy S9 once had. So even without the dual aperture feature that Samsung used in the past, Samsung has a better performance. So let's give you the point on this picture. But I remind you that both devices make the automatic switch to the ultra-wide lens, and in this case I think the iPhone has better focus. Notice how it comes out very detailed in this photograph, and on Samsung the focus could become a little bit imprecise. It looks like it focused more on this area, and I didn't like the result as much. Overall, I think the super macro photography is gonna go to the iPhone with a point. Next, let's look at portrait photography to see what they can do. In this case with the main camera, I think it's a very similar photograph again, slightly warmer colors in the case of the iPhone, but let's zoom in to see the details. The face is perfectly fine in both photographs. Notice that in the case of the iPhone, it had a little bit of a failure here in detecting the depth in the hair, and Galaxy I think did a better job on this part. So right off the bat, it looks like Samsung is having a little bit more accurate detection of all these edges to create the bokeh effect. Let's take a look at all of these areas. Over here, it looks like Samsung had a problem. Let's see if the iPhone does too. Anyway, I keep looking at other parts of the iPhone and I feel like the edges are a little bit cloudy. They don't seem to be as accurate as the Galaxy on this. Yes, the whole arm looks like Samsung has defined it much better as well. Definitely that it seems like the edge detection is better on Samsung. But let's look at this part. And on Samsung it had failed, and on iPhone anyway it also failed. So I think I see a little bit more accuracy on Samsung when it comes to detecting all these edges, and less accuracy on iPhone. So for this portrait photography with the prime lens, the point goes to Samsung. Now we're looking at the 3x zoom portrait. And here the remarkable thing is that the iPhone doesn't actually have any kind of 3x optical lens, and yet it still has a very nice detail. Notice how the texture of the t-shirt comes through very nicely. That really catches my eye, and in Galaxy you're supposed to have a 3x optical lens, and honestly I even see more detail on the iPhone. Let's look at the face. The face looks very similar. The hair also very similar. But the remarkable thing here is that iPhone is not using optical zoom for this photograph. And even notice how the hair in this case, I think iPhone brought it out a little more natural. Samsung seems to have cropped it a bit so you wouldn't notice the cut. But hey, I'm really struck by how well the iPhone does photography in this setting. Let's take another look at the edges. And I think with this setting, Apple has improved the detection quite a bit. And even for the good level of detail it has, I'm going to go ahead and give it the point. Notice in this part of the tree how the iPhone has a much more detailed picture. I have no doubt the point goes to the iPhone. And finally, we have the portraits with the 5x lens, which are the most spectacular portraits on both devices. It looks very nice result, but let's try to see as much detail as possible. Notice the detail that the face has on Samsung. On the iPhone, it's also a very nice detail. There are really few differences in this regard. Let's look at the hair. I think the hair, Apple works it a little bit more natural, although it looks kind of blurry on this part as well. And this part where the hair is less defined. In Samsung, they choose to remove those parts and leave the blur. So I don't know which interpretation you prefer, but in all other things, they're very similar. I think we have pretty accurate edge detection. Let's see on the iPhone. Very similar results. I think in this photograph, I'm not going to give the point to either one of them because I liked both pictures
whereas
very
on the
much. Now we're going to evaluate the selfies, and again we evaluate the preview, because while Samsung fixed the preview of the photos with the rear camera, it lacks to do that with the front camera, because in this case we see overexposed areas and completely burnt areas, while the iPhone has a better preview, so the point goes to the iPhone. In fact, notice that in the photo result. Also, the iPhone has something much better. It seems to me that it doesn't have as overexposed areas as we see it here on Samsung. Even the sky, you see that on Samsung, it's still a little bit overexposed, and some areas of the tree are burned out on Samsung. Whereas on the iPhone, it still holds this lighting well. And in the level of detail of the face, I think both have something quite good. Although I feel even more detail in Samsung's picture. So I think Samsung focused too much on the face, that it forgot a little bit about the rest of the elements of the photo, whereas on iPhone I see a slightly more balanced photo. I'm going to give the point to the iPhone. Now we see a night selfie, and we're going to try to notice the details. We're going to zoom in over here, and because of the noise reduction, Samsung no longer has as much detail as it does in the daytime. And in the case of the iPhone, you get to notice a little bit more detail. Look at the details of the beard. On Samsung, they get to be lost a little bit due to noise reduction. But again, it's the same thing. In the case of the Galaxy, we will have a cleaner picture. Observe in the darker areas, whereas in the case of the iPhone, a noisier photograph will appear. So again, we come to this decision if you prefer more noise and more detail or less noise and less detail, depending on your taste. But at a glance, if I had to choose between one of these two photographs, I'd go with the iPhone. So we're done with the photographs so far, but let's move on to the videos. First, we're evaluating the level of detail that they're capable of, and note that on Samsung we have up to 8K, so it allows us to even have more detail by zooming in closer. And let's see why they look better on the iPhone, but we'll evaluate that later. For now, we're just evaluating the level of detail that we can achieve, and obviously the higher the resolution, the more detail. So the resolution point goes to Galaxy. Now let's evaluate the video outdoors, and I think the iPhone's color is much more natural in video. While in the photograph Samsung improved its color, I think in the video Apple is still ahead. The color of the earth looks much more natural to me. The color of the stones also looks much more natural to me with a bit more contrast. So the point goes to the iPhone in this outdoor video. Now we're evaluating the backlit video recording performance, and let's see why they look very similar. In this aspect, iPhone always won by far, but now they look very even, although I still see some slightly overexposed areas on the Galaxy, especially on the ground part. It looks a little better textured on the iPhone, but the truth is that the difference is very little. But notice how in this case, even in the green area, you see a little more texture on the iPhone. I feel that by little difference really, but I still like the iPhone a little bit better when recording. Now let's take a look at how the stabilization is, in this case without a super stable mode. Both devices are going with the main camera, and it looks very similar when walking around. We're going to go running now and see if you notice any differences. And it looks at times like Galaxy has a little bit more vibration, but let me take a good look, because at times I also feel like on the iPhone we have more vibration. It actually looks very similar, very even on the stabilization. So I don't give the point to anybody. But let's see the result with the super stable mode. It assures us that even in both cases I'm running, and I think the result again is very similar. I don't see any major differences other than the color, which we talked about a moment ago. But talking specifically about stabilization, you see very similar videos in this case. When you're running, I'm not giving anyone the point again. Now we're testing stabilization when zooming in and shooting with the telephoto lens. You see very similar results as well, pretty much the same. So again, I don't give anyone the point. But here it should be noted that the iPhone also allows super steady mode with the telephoto lens, although it appears more cropped the scene. So you don't see the difference as much, but allowing super steady mode with this telephoto lens. It assures us that even if you go with more action, you're going to get a better result. So the point for the iPhone. Now we're looking at night video. Let's see how they perform here. It looks very similar, the result. Although on iPhone, I feel like that reflection that's generated on the lens is a little bit annoying. On Galaxy at the moment, I feel like the color gets a little more yellow than I'd like. Here's the ultra-wide camera, and notice the darker areas also on Samsung look a bit bluer and not as black as they should be. We're gonna notice that right now. Notice on iPhone it looks much better defined. Samsung is struggling a little bit with focus as well. And with respect to the periscope camera, notice on Samsung we have better rendering and better detail. I think in some things I like iPhone better, in other things I like Galaxy better, so they're pretty evenly matched. Because in this periscope camera, definitely that Samsung has better performance, although the noise handling at times may be a little bit better on Samsung as well. Notice in this case you notice a little bit more noise on the iPhone, but specifically with the telephoto lens, because with the main camera and the ultra-wide camera, it seems like the iPhone handled its noise better. So neither seems to me to be totally good or perfect. I think they both have their arguments, and so in this aspect I'm not going to give the point to anyone. Now let's talk about the slow motion, and I must say that here Samsung allows us to record in 4K at 120 frames per second. In the case of the iPhone, we can also record at 120 frames per second, but only in full HD. So for its greater capabilities, we give the point to the Galaxy. Now the slowest slow motion possible on the two devices is 240 frames per second in full HD. Neither is impressive, and they are very similar with the same color difference that we had already seen in the other videos, which I like better on iPhone. But talking specifically about slow motion, they both have pretty much the same capabilities in full HD. Now we'll take a look at the portrait recording mode, which on iPhone is called Cinema. Let's take a look at what the two devices can offer us. And I think in this aspect, they are very evenly matched. They are very similar in their behavior. Notice how the blur also increases when I get closer, and it decreases when I move away. In the two devices, we have a very similar behavior, and in this aspect, totally perfect. Let's move on. And notice that they both have stabilization as well. And they're both also able to keep objects in focus. They're very even in this aspect. Although in lighting, I like the iPhone a little bit better. But talking specifically about portrait mode, they're pretty much the same. Although the iPhone still includes a capability so that when you rotate and look back, it blurs the foreground and focuses on the background. And that Samsung still doesn't have that. So for that slight difference, we're going to give the iPhone the point. Now we're taking a look at the front camera. And I have to say that the iPhone has a slightly wider camera, so you don't need to stretch your arm out as much. And both have good stabilization, both have good color. Let's take a look at the backlit behavior as it is. Here, notice how the sky starts to overexpose on Galaxy. And on iPhone, it still maintains a good rendering. But let's go to even more aggressive backlighting and look at the Earth. Overall, I think it's overexposed in both. But I think we do see a little bit more quality on the iPhone in the backlight. In detail, in a lot of other things, they're very evenly matched, very similar. But I think still the iPhone is giving us a little bit higher quality video on this front-facing camera. So we're going to give the point to the iPhone. Now we're looking at the front camera at night. And I think at first glance, I like the color of the Galaxy better. Although it looks like it's also having some issues with noise handling in the darker areas, but I think it does give me a little bit better color on this front camera. Here we're in a much better lit area, and we have a very similar result. I think there's no big difference here. The main difference is going to be in the darker areas. Notice that the color of the face holds up much better in Galaxy in these darker parts. And in the background, notice, yeah, we have a little bit better definition on the iPhone. In this part where it's very dark in the leaves all the way back there. So again, each one has pros and cons. I don't think either video ends up being totally superior to the other, but if I had to choose between one of the two, I think I'd go with the Galaxy video. The two devices also allow us to record with portrait mode or cinema mode, using the front camera. And again, I think the blur is very natural on both devices. The light handling, again, I like it a little bit better on iPhone. But in this case, specifically talking about portrait and blur, I think they're very similar again. Let's see if zooming in on an object we find any difference. Samsung keeps it perfectly in focus. It seems to me that the iPhone doesn't hold focus as accurately on these objects. Notice the difference. I think I'm going to give Samsung the point here for having better object detection, although the results are very similar. And just as a curious fact, I remind you that in Samsung you can change the blur effects. You can modify the intensity and even switch to other completely different effects like this one, which is much more aggressive. Or also switch to a black and white and color effect. On iPhone, you don't have these additional effects available to get creative. But on iPhone, you do have the feature to flip and blur the foreground to focus on the background. So, in this case, I'm not giving anyone the point. I simply want to point out that both have additional features. But I will give point in this case for the dual camera that Galaxy supports, which can even be in 4K, so you can record with both the front camera and the rear camera. And this can be very attractive for bloggers. On the iPhone, this is not possible natively. So the point goes to Galaxy. And finally, let's evaluate how the microphone of these devices records in an outdoor environment. So let's listen to the audio.
Esta es una prueba de audio con los micrófonos de estos dispositivos. Primero estás escuchando al iPhone 15 Pro Max. Estoy en un entorno donde no hay mucho viento en este momento, pero tarde o temprano pasará un poco de viento. Ahora estás escuchando el Galaxy S24 Ultra. Sigue estando un entorno tranquilo con un poco más de viento que hace un momento. Cambiamos al iPhone, estás escuchando el iPhone. Cambiamos a Galaxy, estás escuchándolo. ¿Qué te parece? Si volvemos a cambiar al iPhone, en este momento hay más viento. Cambiamos a Galaxy rápidamente porque justo en este momento pasó más viento. Cambiamos a iPhone, seguimos en un entorno con un viento, ya se acaba de detener. Creo que pudimos probar bien estos micrófonos y llegó el momento de decidir.
Impressive. I think the iPhone picks up bass frequencies much better. I feel like the voice sounds fuller, but at the same time it doesn't have as good noise reduction in these types of scenarios. So there again, it depends on what you would prefer. Because wind noise, I think the Galaxy reduces it better. But personally, I'm going to lean more towards the iPhone audio, because I like my voice to sound a little bit deeper. And that's it. According to my comparison, the iPhone has won at this point, although I remind you that Samsung is highly likely going to release an update to finish optimizing their camera. So after this update, we will do this comparison again to see if there were changes or not. For now, we have reached the end of this video, but let me know in the comments for you who won and what your score was. See you next time.